She was born in Windsor Castle, great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, a princess who couldn't hear a single word anyone ever said to her. And her reward for surviving war, exile, bombardment, and the near execution of her husband? Sigmund Freud himself declared her insane. Her family believed him. Her husband signed the commitment papers. Then, he ran off with a French actress and never looked back. Here's the thing they got wrong, all of them. Princess Alice of Battenberg wasn't mad. She was traumatized. What looked like paranoid schizophrenia to the greatest psychiatrist of the 20th century was something he didn't have a name for yet. We do now. It's called PTSD. And the woman they locked away, the woman they irradiated and abandoned and forgot about? She went on to risk her life hiding Jews from the Nazis during the Holocaust. This isn't a biography. This is a prosecution, and the evidence is damning. Victoria Alice Elizabeth Julia Marie entered the world on February 25, 1885, in the most prestigious delivery room in the British Empire, Windsor Castle. Queen Victoria in attendance. The full pageantry of late Victorian royalty surrounding her crib. Her mother was Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine, Victoria's granddaughter. Her father, Prince Louis Alexander of Battenberg, would eventually become First Sea Lord of the British Navy. Alice was royalty of the highest possible order. And she was deaf. Not partially, not mildly, profoundly deaf from birth, a congenital dysfunction of her eustachian tubes that went undiagnosed until she was 4 years old. For the first years of her life, her parents simply didn't understand why this child watched faces so intently, why she struggled to speak, why she seemed different from her relatives in ways they couldn't articulate. What happened when they finally figured it out? They might have treated her as limited, fragile, dependent on others. That's what happened to deaf children in the 1880s. Alice refused. She taught herself to lip read, not just in English, in German, French, and Greek. She could switch between languages mid-conversation, depending on who was speaking to her. She learned to speak clearly despite never hearing her own voice. Contemporary accounts describe her as brilliant, socially capable, and possessed of a determination that bordered on ferocious. This was not a woman predisposed to delusion. This was a woman who had spent her entire life fighting to connect with a world she couldn't hear. Remember that, because when they diagnosed her as insane 45 years later, they forgot it entirely. On October 7, 1903, 18-year-old Alice married Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark at Darmstadt. 3 ceremonies: civil, Lutheran, Greek Orthodox. He was charming, handsome, the 4th son of King George I of Greece. They seemed like a fairy tale. They settled into the Greek royal court. They built a family. Princess Margarita came in 1905, Theodora in 1906, Cecile in 1911, Sophie in 1914, and finally, on June 10, 1921, a son, Prince Philip, who would grow up to marry Queen Elizabeth II. Alice wasn't some footnote to British royal history. She was its matriarch. But between those children, between those births, something else happened. Something that would break her in ways no one recognized at the time. War. October 1912. The Balkan Wars erupt. Alice is 27 years old, a princess who grew up in palaces, mother to 4 daughters. She could have done what royal women were supposed to do: wave from balconies, boost morale from a safe distance, look concerned without actually getting her hands dirty. She chose the front. Not the symbolic front, the actual front. Field hospitals where men were bleeding out from artillery wounds. Surgical tents where doctors were amputating limbs without adequate anesthesia. Alice walked into that carnage and worked. We have her letters. November 2nd, 1912. She wrote to her mother describing her afternoon at a field hospital following the Battle of Kylar. Here's what she said. Our last afternoon at Kozani was spent in assisting at the amputation of a leg. I had to give chloroform at a certain moment and prevent the patient from biting his tongue, and also to hand cotton wool, basins, etc. Once I got over my feeling of disgust, it was very interesting. Read that last phrase again. It was very interesting. That's not the language of someone processing trauma in a healthy way. That's dissociation. That's a mind compartmentalizing horror into something manageable because the alternative is breaking down completely. In the same letter, she describes the severed limb left on the floor. She had to direct another nurse to retrieve it, to find somewhere to bury it. This was a princess. A deaf woman who had grown up surrounded by servants and protocol. Now she was standing in blood, watching surgeons saw through bone, holding down soldiers who were screaming in languages she couldn't hear. This wasn't one afternoon. This was months. Day after day. Amputation after amputation. Young men who would never walk again. Young men who wouldn't survive the night. The smell of gangrene. The flies, the inadequate supplies. Alice worked through all of it, refusing to stop, refusing to slow down, refusing to acknowledge that what she was doing might be destroying her from the inside. Her mother's lady-in-waiting, a woman named Nona Kerr, observed Alice during this period and grew alarmed. She wrote that Alice was very thin and noted that, at present, she simply can't stop doing things. Hypervigilance, compulsive activity, inability to rest. Any modern psychiatrist would recognize those symptoms immediately. But in 1912, there was no framework for understanding trauma. There was only the expectation that a strong woman would carry on, and Alice carried on. For her service, King George V awarded Alice the Royal Red Cross in 1913, official recognition that she had served with distinction under fire. What no one gave her was time to heal, space to process, any acknowledgement that what she had witnessed might leave scars you couldn't see. The Balkan Wars were just the beginning. December 1st, 1916, World War I. The French Navy bombards Athens as part of Allied pressure on Greece's neutralist king. Alice and her children huddle in the palace cellars while shells explode overhead. She can't hear the warnings. She can't hear the all clear. A deaf woman, crouching in darkness with her children, reading the panic on faces around her to know if they're going to survive the night. Her brother-in-law is the king being targeted. Her husband has been accused in the British House of Commons of being a German spy. Think about that for a moment. Shells falling, children crying, and you can't hear any of it. You can only see the terror in the eyes of everyone around you. You can only watch their mouths move and try to understand whether they're saying, "It's safe," or "We're going to die." The world is collapsing. She's in a cellar with her children, waiting. By June 1917, it becomes unbearable. King Constantine abdicates. The Greek royal family, Alice, Andrew, their children, are forced into exile. Switzerland. 3 years of political limbo. A princess without a country, stateless, waiting while Europe tears itself apart. 3 years, and then 1920. Return to Greece, brief hope, and then 1922, when everything falls apart for good. The Greek army suffers a catastrophic defeat in the Greco-Turkish War. A revolutionary committee seizes power in Athens. Prince Andrew, who had served as commander of the Second Army Corps, is arrested, charged with disobeying orders during the campaign. Alice's husband is going to be shot. That's what everyone believed. The Revolutionary Committee was executing people. Former ministers and generals arrested alongside Andrew were given brief show trials and then killed. British diplomats assumed Andrew would face the same fate. The father of Alice's 5 children, including infant Philip, just 18 months old, was likely going to be taken into a courtyard and murdered. Alice waited. Days of uncertainty. Her husband in a cell somewhere. The knowledge that other prisoners were being taken out and shot. No word on whether Andrew would be next. No word on whether she would become a widow. No word on whether her children would grow up without a father. The trial came in December 1922. It was theater. Humiliation disguised as justice. Andrew was found completely lacking in high military command experience, a verdict that destroyed his self-image while technically sparing his life. He was banished from Greece forever. Mercy packaged as insult. Survival delivered as shame. Then the evacuation. HMS Calypso. British naval intervention to get the family out before the Revolutionary Committee changed its mind. Alice, Andrew, 5 children, fleeing on a warship. Prince Philip, 18 months old, transported in an improvised cot fashioned from an orange crate. An orange crate. That's how the future husband of Queen Elizabeth II left Greece, in a fruit box. So let's count the trauma. A deaf woman who served as a frontline nurse during the Balkan Wars, witnessing amputations and death. The same woman sheltering in a cellar with her children during a naval bombardment. 3 years of exile in Switzerland. The near execution of her husband. The complete destruction of her family's position. Flight on a warship with an infant in a crate. Any psychiatrist alive today would look at that timeline and see one thing: a textbook case for post-traumatic stress disorder. What did the psychiatrists of 1930 see? Paranoid schizophrenia. The family settled in Saint-Cloud, outside Paris, a small house loaned by relatives. Charity, and everyone knew it. Alice threw herself into work at a charity shop for Greek refugees, people who had lost even more than she had. She was trying to rebuild purpose from wreckage. Her husband was not rebuilding. He was retreating. The humiliation of the trial, the loss of his military identity, the dependency on others. It hollowed Andrew out. He grew distant, absent, bitter. The marriage that had survived war and exile began to fracture under the weight of peacetime failure. Andrew started spending more and more time away from the family, trips that lasted longer than they should, absences that no one explained. In October 1928, Alice converted to the Greek Orthodox Church. To her, it was spiritual homecoming, a connection to the country and faith that had defined her adult life. To her family, it looked like instability, a dramatic, unexplained shift. By late 1929, Alice's behavior became impossible to ignore. She claimed she was receiving divine messages. She said she had healing powers. She reported direct communication with Jesus Christ, with Buddha. She declared herself the bride of Christ. She practiced automatic writing, letting her hand move across the page, channeling what she believed were supernatural communications. She declared herself a saint. Her mother arrived at St. Cloud to find her daughter in what she described as a very poor state, both mentally and physically. The family convened. The decision was made. In early February 1930, Princess Alice of Battenberg, great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, war veteran, mother of 5, was admitted to Kurhaus Schloss Tegel, an exclusive psychoanalytic sanatorium near Berlin. Dr. Ernst Simmel ran the facility. Simmel was respected, a member of Freud's inner circle, a pioneer in treating war neurosis. War neurosis, the very condition Alice almost certainly suffered from. The bitter irony is suffocating. Simmel had literally written about trauma-induced psychological disturbance in soldiers, and when a traumatized woman was placed in his care, the diagnosis that emerged was paranoid schizophrenia. The question of Sigmund Freud's direct involvement is critical. Freud didn't treat Alice personally. By 1930, he was 73, focused on theoretical work. But he was consulted. His opinion was sought. His word carried weight in any case handled by his disciples. What did the father of psychoanalysis recommend for this deaf, traumatized, abandoned princess? Freud suggested that Alice's symptoms, the religious preoccupations, the grandiose claims, were rooted in sexual frustration. Her libido needed to be suppressed through medical intervention. The method chosen was X-ray irradiation of her ovaries. Read that again. They pointed X-rays at her ovaries to induce artificial menopause, to chemically castrate her, because Freud believed destroying her capacity for sexual desire would cure her delusions. A woman who had served as a frontline nurse, survived bombardments, watched her husband nearly executed, raised 5 children through chaos and displacement. This woman was diagnosed as insane because she had religious visions. And the treatment was to destroy her reproductive organs with radiation. This wasn't medicine. This was butchery in clinical language. And the most famous psychiatrist in the world endorsed it. But Freud wasn't the only villain in Alice's story. He was the institutional failure, the machinery of psychiatric authority grinding a traumatized woman into a diagnosis. The personal betrayal came from someone closer, her husband. Prince Andrew signed the commitment papers. Let that sink in. The man who had pledged to honor and protect her, the father of her 5 children, put his signature on the documents that locked her away. He handed his wife over to the sanatorium, and then he left. The same year Alice was committed, 1930, Prince Andrew began an affair with André de la Bigne, a French actress and socialite. Some accounts suggest the relationship started earlier, during the Saint-Cloud years when the marriage was already dying. What's certain is this: once Alice was safely locked away, Andrew felt no obligation to maintain even the pretense of a family. He moved to Monte Carlo, the playground of Europe's idle rich. He spent the rest of his years gambling, entertaining his mistress, and avoiding any responsibility for the wife he had committed or the children he had scattered. While Alice sat in institutions, Andrew sat at casino tables. While she underwent barbaric treatments designed to suppress her sexuality, he was sleeping with an actress. While she tried to understand why the world had abandoned her, he was ordering champagne and playing roulette, as if his family had never existed. The years that followed were a nightmare of institutional control. Alice was moved between facilities, Tegel first, then Kreuzlingen in Switzerland. Different doctors, different approaches, same diagnosis, same fundamental misunderstanding of what they were looking at. And then, silence, disappearance, the wilderness years. Sometime around 1932 or 1933, Alice was released from formal institutional care. But released is a generous word for what actually happened. She wasn't welcomed back into her family. She wasn't reunited with her children. She wasn't given a home, a purpose, a place to belong. She was simply let go, cast adrift. For the next several years, Alice existed as a ghost. She drifted through Europe, Germany, Greece, various places where she could stay temporarily without attracting too much attention. She often lived incognito, avoiding the royal circles that had once defined her existence. The woman who had been born in Windsor Castle, who had married into Greek royalty, who had been a princess her entire life, now moved through the world as though trying to be invisible. Where was her husband during these years? Monte Carlo. Still with his mistress. Still at the casino. Where were her children? Scattered. Her 4 daughters had all married between 1930 and 1931, the same year their mother was committed. Margarita married into German nobility. Feodora married into German nobility. Cecile married into German nobility. Sophie married into German nobility. All 4 daughters, all German princes. And some of those German princes were becoming something far more dangerous than mere aristocrats. Sophie's husband, Prince Christoph of Hesse, joined the Nazi Party, then the SS. He became a high-ranking officer in Heinrich Himmler's organization, the apparatus of terror that would eventually orchestrate the Holocaust. Alice's own son-in-law wore the SS uniform. Think about what that means for what comes later. Prince Philip, the youngest, was shuffled between relatives. He attended schools in France, England, Germany, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. His mother was a ghost drifting through Europe. His father was in Monte Carlo. He was essentially orphaned while both parents still lived. And then came November 16th, 1937. A Sabina flight from Austin to London crashed in heavy fog. Everyone on board was killed. Among the dead, Princess Cecile, Alice's third daughter. Also killed, Cecile's husband, Grand Duke Georg Donatus of Hesse. Their two young sons, Cecile's mother-in-law. Cecile was 8 months pregnant. An entire family wiped out in an instant. The funeral was held in Darmstadt, Germany. It was Alice's first reunion with her family since the asylum. 7 years of drifting, of isolation, of being treated as though she had ceased to exist. And now, she was standing at her daughter's grave. The scene was grotesque in ways that went beyond grief. Nazi Germany in 1937 was not subtle about its allegiances. The funeral procession included men in Nazi uniforms. Swastikas were present. High-ranking officials of the regime attended to pay respects to the German noble families. Prince Philip, Alice's 16-year-old son, walked in the procession, surrounded by relatives who had aligned themselves with Hitler's government. Alice stood among them. The woman they had diagnosed as insane. The woman whose ovaries they had irradiated. The woman whose husband had abandoned her. She watched her daughter buried in a Germany that was preparing for conquest, surrounded by the uniforms of a regime that would soon attempt to exterminate an entire people. She said nothing publicly. What was there to say? Her family had moved on without her. Her daughters had married into the machinery of fascism. Her son was an orphan in all but name. Her husband was still in Monte Carlo. But she saw, she understood. And whatever she felt in that moment, she carried it with her to Athens, where she returned to live in 1938. Alone, waiting for what came next. What came next was war. Again. When Nazi Germany occupied Greece in 1941, Princess Alice was living in Athens. She was 56 years old, a former psychiatric patient, a woman the world had dismissed as mad. Her husband was still in Monte Carlo with his mistress. Her children were scattered across Europe, some of them on the German side of the conflict. Sophie's husband, the SS officer, was flying missions for the Luftwaffe. Alice's own son-in-law was fighting for the regime that now controlled Greece. She could have left. She could have fled to England, to safety, to the protection of her royal relatives. Her son Philip was serving in the British Navy, fighting against the Axis powers. She could have gone to him. She stayed. And she did something that still defies comprehension when you consider the circumstances. The Cohen family. Rachel Cohen, widow of Haimaki Cohen, and 2 of her children, were Jewish. When the Nazis began rounding up Greek Jews for deportation to the death camps, Rachel Cohen reached out to Princess Alice. They had a connection. Haimaki Cohen had helped the Greek royal family during the political turmoil of the 1920s. Now his widow needed help. Alice hid them. In her home, in Athens. With Nazi soldiers patrolling the streets outside, while her son-in-law wore an SS uniform, while her daughters lived in Nazi Germany as members of the aristocratic establishment. Alice chose to risk everything, her life, whatever remained of her reputation, whatever fragile peace she had found, to save Jews from the Holocaust. Think about the risk. This wasn't a farmhouse in the countryside where visitors were rare. This was the home of a prominent royal, a woman whose movements were watched, whose household was known. German officials came to Athens. They came to her neighborhood.
They came, on at least one occasion, to her door. There's a story, and it has the weight of documented history, about what happened when the Gestapo came asking questions. They wanted to know about her activities. They wanted to know if she was hiding anyone. Alice played deaf. She had been deaf her entire life, but she had learned to lip-read with extraordinary precision. She understood everything people said to her. She could follow conversations in 4 languages. But when the Gestapo showed up, she became the deaf woman everyone had always assumed she was. She pretended not to understand their questions. She smiled vaguely. She shook her head in confusion. She became unhelpful in the way that only someone with a perfect excuse can be. The Gestapo left. The Cohen family survived. This was the woman Sigmund Freud had diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic. This was the woman whose husband had committed her to a sanatorium because she had religious visions. This was the woman everyone had decided was too unstable, too detached from reality, too broken to function in the world. And here she was, lying to the Gestapo, hiding Jews, risking her life, functioning with more moral clarity than the men who had diagnosed and abandoned her ever showed in their entire careers. Her son-in-law died in 1943. Prince Christoph of Hesse, the SS officer, Sophie's husband, was killed when his plane crashed in Italy. Alice's daughter was now a widow, her husband dead fighting for Hitler, while Alice was hiding Jews from Hitler's regime in Athens. The occupation lasted years. Alice kept the Cohen family hidden for the duration. She never wavered. She never broke. She never asked for recognition or reward. She simply did what she believed was right, in defiance of the most murderous regime in human history, a regime that her own daughters had married into. So here's the case for the prosecution. The diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, delivered in 1930, reflected the psychiatric limitations of that era. Schizophrenia was the default label for any severe mental disturbance doctors couldn't explain, especially when the patient presented with religious delusions. There was no formal diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder in 1930. That wouldn't enter medical literature until 1980, 50 years later. The psychiatrist treating Alice had no framework for understanding that what they observed might be the delayed consequence of accumulated trauma rather than endogenous psychosis. But we have that framework now. Consider the diagnostic criteria for PTSD: exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Intrusive symptoms like distressing memories or flashbacks, persistent avoidance, negative alterations in mood, marked changes in arousal and reactivity. Alice had witnessed death repeatedly during her nursing service. She had experienced direct threat to her own life and her children's lives during the bombardment. She had lived through her husband's near execution. She had lost her home, her country, her status, and her marriage in successive waves. And the religious visions? The ones that alarmed her family so much? PTSD frequently manifests as a search for meaning, the traumatized mind trying to construct a narrative that makes sense of senseless suffering. Alice's belief that she was communicating with Christ, that she'd been chosen for special purpose, wasn't necessarily psychosis. It was her mind finding coherence in a life that had been shattered. The grandiosity they called delusional might have been survival mechanism, a way of asserting significance after years of powerlessness. Here's the strongest evidence. She recovered. True paranoid schizophrenia rarely resolves completely. It's a chronic, deteriorating condition. The trajectory is typically downward. But Alice? Alice got better. She was released from institutional care. She went on to live a functional life, more than functional, heroic.
After the war ended, Alice remained in Greece. She eventually founded an order of Greek Orthodox nuns, the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary, fulfilling the religious calling that her doctors had once pathologized as delusion. The woman they said was insane because she believed she had a spiritual purpose went on to dedicate her life to that purpose, and no one called her crazy anymore. She died on December 5, 1969, at Buckingham Palace. Her son Philip had married Princess Elizabeth in 1947, and Elizabeth had become queen in 1952. Alice spent her final years living with them, a quiet presence in the halls of power, the mother-in-law of the most famous monarch in the world. But the vindication didn't end with her death. In 1993, Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust memorial institution, recognized Princess Alice as one of the righteous among nations.
It's the highest honor Israel bestows on non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Her name is inscribed on the Wall of Honor in the Garden of the Righteous. Her story is preserved in the archives of heroism. And her body? It was eventually moved from Windsor to Jerusalem. She is buried at the Church of Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives, the holiest ground in one of the world's holiest cities. The woman her family committed to a sanatorium now rests among prophets and saints. Not a madwoman, a hero. People keep asking why Hollywood hasn't made this movie. 170 comments on videos about her, and half of them are asking the same question. How has no one turned this into a film? The answer is probably uncomfortable. The royal family, her descendants, might prefer certain chapters stay closed. There are stories here that don't reflect well on anyone. The husband who abandoned her, the doctors who mutilated her, the daughters who married Nazis, the family members who signed the papers. The psychiatric establishment might not want their most famous figure indicted for misdiagnosing a war hero. There are rights issues, sensitivities, the general reluctance to portray mental illness in a way that challenges official narratives. But the real reason might be simpler. Her story is too big, too contradictory, too difficult to reduce to a 3-act structure with a tidy resolution. Because there is no resolution. Not really. Freud died in 1939. He never reconsidered the diagnosis. Prince Andrew died in Monte Carlo in 1944, still with his mistress, still having never reconciled with Alice. The psychiatric establishment has never formally acknowledged that the treatment she received was barbaric malpractice. What we have instead is the evidence, the timeline, the trauma that anyone alive today would recognize, and the inescapable conclusion that everyone got it wrong. Princess Alice of Battenberg was born deaf in Windsor Castle. She taught herself to lip read in 4 languages. She served as a frontline nurse in war. She survived bombardment, exile, the near execution of her husband, and the complete destruction of her family's position. She watched her marriage collapse while she was locked in a sanatorium. She had her ovaries irradiated because Sigmund Freud thought her religious feelings were sexual frustration. She buried her daughter in Nazi Germany. She watched her other daughters marry into the regime. And then she hid Jews from the Nazis anyway. She used her deafness, the disability that had defined her entire life, the condition that everyone always saw as a limitation, as a weapon against the Gestapo. She turned what the world considered her weakness into her greatest strength. She fooled murderers into leaving her alone so she could continue saving lives. She wasn't mad. She was the best of them. The most underrated royal who ever lived. The only one worth a damn. And now, finally, we know it. Subscribe for more stories like this.